The story begins not with gunfire or flashing lights, but with quiet ambition and calculated patience. In the early morning hush of Lower Manhattan, long before the city became a monument of steel and glass, a young boy learned that power did not always belong to the loudest voice in the room. Sometimes it belonged to the calmest mind. Johnny Torrio was born into a world shaped by struggle, immigration, and survival. His family came from Italy, like so many others, chasing the fragile promise of opportunity in America. They settled in neighborhoods where poverty forced children to grow up quickly and where intelligence often mattered more than strength. From a young age, Torrio learned to observe rather than react, to listen rather than boast. While other boys fought in the streets, he watched how influence moved quietly behind closed doors. As a teenager, Torrio migrated to Brooklyn, where the lines between legitimate business and underground operations blurred into one another. He was never reckless, he never chased attention. Instead, he studied people. He noticed which men spoke too much and which men were trusted to stay silent. He learned that true control came not from fear alone, but from respect and reliability. At a time when crime organizations were chaotic and driven by ego, Torrio stood apart. He understood structure. He believed disorder was weakness. His early work involved gambling operations, protection rackets, and coordination between small groups that lacked leadership. Torrio did not threaten. He negotiated. He did not dominate. He organized. This approach earned him quiet recognition. Older, more volatile figures saw in Torrio something rare: discipline. He avoided unnecessary violence, understanding that bloodshed attracted attention. Police pressure increased with every reckless act, and Torrio wanted longevity, not notoriety. His vision was not chaos, it was sustainability. When opportunity came knocking, it arrived from Chicago, a city exploding with industrial growth, political corruption, and untapped potential. Torrio was invited west by relatives already embedded in the city's criminal underworld. Chicago at the time was fragmented, many gangs, little coordination, endless conflict. Torrio immediately recognized the inefficiency. Where others saw opportunity through brute force, Torrio saw opportunity through unification. Then came prohibition. When alcohol was outlawed in 1920, the entire underworld changed overnight. What had once been small-time gambling and street operations transformed into billion-dollar empires built on bootlegging, distribution, and political bribery. Torrio understood faster than most that this was not a temporary phase. It was a structural shift. The demand for alcohol would not disappear. It would go underground. Instead of flooding the streets with violence, Torrio constructed networks. He partnered with brewers, drivers, warehouse owners, and corrupt officials. He ensured protection not just through threats, but through mutual profit. Everyone benefited, and therefore everyone stayed loyal. Torrio's genius was not criminal creativity, it was management. He believed that crime should be run like a corporation. Clear roles, clear hierarchies, limited exposure, disputes settled quietly. Violence used only when unavoidable. This philosophy reduced chaos and maximized profit. It also minimized law enforcement pressure, allowing operations to grow without interruption. One of Torrio's most significant decisions was identifying talent. He had an eye for potential, and he believed in mentorship. Among those he guided was a young man with ambition, charm, and an explosive reputation. Someone Torrio would later shape into a leader rather than a weapon. Torrio didn't just build an empire, he engineered successors. Behind closed doors, Torrio spent long hours planning logistics, negotiating boundaries with rival factions, and building alliances that reduced conflict. He understood that peace was more profitable than war. His meetings were calm. His tone was polite. His reputation grew not as a gangster, but as a gentleman strategist. Chicago slowly changed under his influence. Street wars declined. Profits increased. Political connections deepened. Torrio worked with city officials, law enforcement intermediaries, and business owners who preferred quiet cooperation over chaos. Bribes were structured. Payments were predictable. The machine ran smoothly, but power, no matter how carefully managed, attracts envy. As Torrio's influence expanded, rival groups began to resent his control. They viewed his calm approach as weakness. They underestimated the danger of a man who never raised his voice. While Torrio continued refining operations, unseen enemies planned differently. One winter night, the illusion of control shattered. Torrio survived an assassination attempt that nearly ended his life. Bullets tore through the quiet order he had built, reminding him that even the most disciplined empires existed in violent worlds. As he lay recovering, Torrio made a decision that would alter the future of organized crime forever. He would step back, not out of fear but out of wisdom. Torrio believed leadership was knowing when to leave. He had built the system. Now, it was time to let it function without him. Unlike others who clung to power until death, Torrio chose survival. He passed authority to those he had trained, confident that the structure would hold. And it did. From the shadows, Torrio watched his philosophy reshape organized crime across America. His methods influenced generations, replacing chaos with coordination, impulse with intelligence. He never sought fame. He never wrote memoirs. Yet his fingerprints remained on every system that followed. Johnny Torrio was not the loudest gangster of his era. He was the quiet architect behind the curtain. A man who proved that empires are not built by rage but by restraint. The night after the attack left more than physical scars. It forced a reckoning. As the city slept, wrapped in winter silence, Johnny Torrio lay awake, staring into the dim glow of a hospital room, listening to the faint rhythm of machines that reminded him how close he had come to the end. He did not feel anger. He did not crave revenge. What filled his thoughts instead was calculation. Violence, he realized, was not just a threat, it was a liability. For years, Torrio had believed that structure could tame chaos, that rational systems could outlast reckless ambition. But the bullets that nearly ended his life proved something else. Even the most carefully built empire attracted men who preferred destruction over order. Survival, therefore, required evolution. When Torrio returned to Chicago, weakened but alive, he moved quietly. There were no public appearances, no declarations of power. He met only with those he trusted completely. His conversations shifted from expansion to preservation, from dominance to continuity. He reviewed every operation with surgical precision. Alcohol distribution routes were shortened to reduce exposure. Middlemen were eliminated to prevent leaks. Payments were standardized and documented mentally, never written down, never spoken twice. Torrio insisted on discipline, knowing that carelessness was often the first step toward collapse. At the same time, he began withdrawing from daily control. This was not retreat, it was delegation. Torrio believed that true leadership meant building something that could survive without its creator. He had spent years shaping individuals who understood his philosophy. Profit over pride, silence over spectacle, patience over impulse. Chicago's criminal underworld continued functioning smoothly, almost mechanically. Deliveries arrived on time. Corrupt officials were paid promptly. Conflicts were settled privately. From the outside, it appeared effortless, but beneath the surface, Torrio's influence guided every decision like an invisible hand. While others flaunted wealth and power, Torrio lived modestly. He avoided excess. He dressed simply, spoke politely, and never lingered in places where attention gathered. He understood that notoriety shortened lives. The louder a man became, the shorter his future. As months passed, Torrio began planning his final exit, not from crime entirely, but from its center. He studied international laws, extradition treaties, and jurisdictions that offer distance rather than protection. His mind, always strategic, now focused on longevity rather than legacy. What separated Torrio from others was his acceptance of limits. He did not believe in endless growth. Every empire, he believed, reached a point where expansion increased risk instead of reward. The smartest move was knowing when enough was enough. Behind the scenes, he arranged financial security that did not rely on active control. Investments were spread quietly through legitimate businesses. Funds were hidden through trusted intermediaries. Torrio ensured that his absence would not create instability. The system would continue running, indifferent to his presence. As he stepped further back, Chicago's streets grew louder without him. Violence began creeping in again, not immediately, but gradually. New leaders interpreted power differently. They believed fear was more effective than trust. Torrio watched this shift with quiet resignation. He knew the consequences would come, just not when. He did not interfere. To Torrio, leadership was not about correction, it was about foundation. He had laid his groundwork. What others built upon it was beyond his control, and control, he had learned, was always temporary. Eventually, Torrio left the city altogether. There were no farewells, no announcements. One day he was simply gone. Chicago barely noticed. Empires rarely acknowledge their architects once the walls stand. In his absence, his influence became more apparent. Criminal organizations across the country adopted similar structures, hierarchies, division of labor, negotiated territories. Torrio's methods spread quietly, reshaping the underworld without bearing his name. He had become an idea rather than a man, living away from the spotlight. Torrio observed the world with the same calm curiosity that had guided him as a boy. He followed news carefully, reading between the lines. Arrests, trials, public scandals each confirmed what he had always known. Disorder consumed those who chased attention. Torrio did not regret his choices. He had never wanted fame. Power had been a tool, not a destination. His satisfaction came from survival, from knowing he had outlived rivals who believed themselves untouchable. As the years passed, prohibition eventually ended, just as Torrio had predicted. The massive profits disappeared overnight. Those who had built empires solely on alcohol collapsed under legal pressure. Others adapted too slowly. Torrio, long removed from the center, watched as history proved him right. He understood cycles. Laws changed. Markets shifted. But human behavior remained constant. Greed, impatience, and ego destroyed more empires than law enforcement ever could. In quiet moments, Torrio reflected not on crimes committed but on lessons learned. That intelligence mattered more than intimidation. That silence protected better than threats. That stepping away could be the most powerful move a man could make. By the time the world moved on, Torrio had already faded into the background, living as a private citizen with an extraordinary past. Few recognized him. Fewer still understood what he had built. But that anonymity was his greatest achievement. Johnny Torrio did not die young in a hail of bullets. He did not rot in a prison cell. He lived, watched, and survived. In a world where power devoured its own, survival was the ultimate victory. And somewhere, deep within the structure of organized crime, his philosophy still echoed, quiet, controlled, and enduring. Distance did not dull the mind that had once shaped an empire. Even far from Chicago, Johnny Torrio continued to think in patterns, probabilities, and outcomes. His days were quieter now, marked by routine rather than urgency. But his awareness never faded. He understood that leaving power behind did not mean escaping its consequences. Influence, once released into the world, traveled on its own. Torrio lived deliberately. He chose places where anonymity was natural and curiosity was rare. He avoided familiar faces, not out of fear, but out of discipline. Old connections carried old risks. He preferred distance, not only physical, but emotional. Nostalgia had no place in survival. He followed events from afar, watching how men he once advised interpreted the system he left behind. Some understood it. Others misunderstood it entirely. The structure remained, but the philosophy began to fracture. Efficiency gave way to excess. Subtlety was replaced by spectacle. Torrio observed this without interference, aware that correction would invite attention, and attention always carried danger. The underworld had changed tone. Violence became louder, more public. Power was displayed instead of concealed. Torrio recognized the pattern immediately. This was the cycle he had predicted: success, breeding arrogance, arrogance inviting destruction. He spent long evenings reflecting on what separated him from others. It was not intelligence alone. Many men were clever. It was restraint. Torrio had never believed himself invincible. That belief, he knew, was fatal. While others built identities around fear, Torrio had built systems around predictability. He had never relied on intimidation as a primary tool. Fear was unstable. It demanded constant reinforcement. Cooperation, on the other hand, sustained itself through shared benefit. This philosophy extended beyond crime. Torrio viewed the world as a network of interests rather than enemies. Governments, businesses, criminals each followed incentives. Control came not from domination, but from understanding motivation. As years passed, Torrio saw new generations rise, men who had never experienced the fragile uncertainty of early prohibition. They inherited wealth without understanding scarcity. They commanded loyalty without earning trust. Torrio recognized their fate long before it arrived. In private moments, he reviewed his life not with pride, but with clarity. He had never imagined himself as a legend. History would reduce his story to footnotes, overshadowed by louder names, and that suited him perfectly. Legends attracted scrutiny. Survivors attracted silence. He maintained contact with the world through carefully chosen intermediaries, people who did not ask questions and did not offer opinions. Conversations were brief. Information was exchanged efficiently. Torrio never spoke of the past unless necessary. Memory was a tool, not a refuge. When authorities intensified efforts against organized crime nationwide, Torrio felt no panic. He had already removed himself from direct association. His financial security rested on legal fronts and long-term investments that blended seamlessly into legitimate markets. Paper trails led nowhere. Names dissolved into layers of separation. What fascinated Torrio most was how law enforcement often misunderstood its adversaries. They chased individuals instead of systems. They focused on arrests rather than incentives. Torrio had always believed that dismantling structure required patience, not force. But patience was rare on both sides of the law. As crackdowns increased, organizations splintered. Alliances dissolved. Former partners turned informants. Torrio watched this unraveling without satisfaction. It confirmed his beliefs, but it also reinforced a truth he had accepted long ago: nothing built on greed alone could last. He began writing not memoirs, never that, but private notes, observations on power, discipline, and human behavior. These writings were never intended for publication. They were exercises in clarity, reminders of principles that had guided him. Torrio believed that wisdom unexamined eventually faded. Time softened the edges of memory. The streets, once vivid with urgency, became distant abstractions. Yet the lessons remained sharp. Torrio had learned that the most dangerous moment in any rise was the belief that ascent would never end. In moments of solitude, he considered the cost of his choices. He acknowledged them without excuse or justification. He did not romanticize his past. Crime, to Torrio, had never been glamorous. It was transactional, calculated, and often cruel. He had simply navigated it better than most. As age crept in, Torrio embraced routine even more firmly. Regular walks, simple meals, quiet observation. He valued predictability now more than power. Chaos had once been something to manage. Now it was something to avoid entirely. The world outside continued to mythologize fears he had once guided or replaced. Newspapers celebrated their rise and sensationalized their falls. Torrio recognized the irony. The men remembered most vividly were often the least strategic. Noise created memory. Silence created survival. Occasionally, Torrio encountered people who unknowingly echoed his philosophies: businessmen, administrators, planners, individuals who understood systems instinctively. He listened to them with interest, seeing fragments of his own thinking reflected in legitimate worlds. It reassured him that his principles were not bound to crime, they were universal. As his life moved further from its origins, Torrio felt no urge to return. Closure did not require revisiting the past. He had already concluded that chapter internally, even if history never would. In his final reflections of the era that defined him, Torrio reached one conclusion with certainty. The greatest illusion of power was permanence. Everything moved, everything shifted. Only adaptability endured. Johnny Torrio had adapted when others resisted. He had stepped away when others clung tighter, and in doing so, he achieved what few ever did in his world. He lived long enough to watch the consequences unfold without him. Silence became his legacy, not because he was forgotten, but because he chose not to be remembered loudly. In a world addicted to spectacle, restraint was his quiet rebellion, and as night settled once more, Torrio rested easily, knowing that the empire he built had already taught its final lesson, not through words, but through time. Time has a way of stripping away illusion, leaving only truth behind. For Johnny Torrio, truth arrived quietly, not as a revelation, but as confirmation of everything he always believed. Distance from power did not weaken his understanding of it. If anything, it sharpened his perspective. From afar, he observed how quickly authority transformed those who inherited it. Men who once listened carefully now spoke recklessly. Agreements once honored with discipline became flexible under the pressure of greed. Torrio saw the familiar pattern repeat itself again and again, like a wheel that could not stop turning. He understood now more than ever that power was never about possession. It was about balance. The moment balance tipped toward excess, collapse followed naturally. He had designed systems to resist that collapse. But no system could survive leaders who misunderstood restraint. Torrio's days unfolded slowly, intentionally uneventful. He believed calm was not accidental, it was engineered. Every choice he made reduced exposure. Every routine reinforced stability. He kept his life narrow by design, knowing that complexity invited vulnerability. In moments of reflection, he considered how close he had come to disappearing entirely. The memory of that near-fatal night never haunted him, but it guided him. It reminded him that chance played a role no strategy could eliminate. All one could do was reduce risk and accept uncertainty. As the years passed, the criminal landscape evolved, new markets emerged. New laws shifted incentives. Torrio noticed how those still operating clung to old methods long after conditions changed. Adaptation, he realized, was the rarest skill of all. He had always believed that intelligence without flexibility was useless. The world rewarded those who adjusted quietly rather than those who resisted loudly. Torrio adjusted early, and that single decision had preserved his life. From his quiet vantage point, he saw the consequences unfold for others. Arrests came suddenly. Alliances collapsed overnight. Men who once commanded fear were reduced to headlines and courtroom sketches. Torrio did not feel superiority watching this. He felt distance. Their mistakes were familiar, almost predictable. He rarely spoke of morality, but privately he acknowledged responsibility. He did not deny his role in shaping a system that caused harm. Yet he also understood that chaos would have existed regardless. His contribution had been order, not innocence. Torrio believed the world was shaped less by good and evil than by competence and incompetence. History favored those who managed complexity well. Those who did not became cautionary tales. In rare conversations, when asked about success, Torrio avoided specifics. He spoke instead about patience, listening, and the importance of choosing silence over reaction. People often mistook silence for weakness. Torrio knew better. Silence was preparation. As age softened his physical presence, his mind remained disciplined. He continued to analyze events, not out of obsession, but habit. Strategy had never been a phase, it was a way of seeing. He noticed how society itself mirrored the underworld more than it admitted. Corporations expanded recklessly. Politicians chased visibility. Institutions collapsed under the weight of their own ambition. Torrio recognized the same patterns he had seen decades earlier, simply dressed in legitimacy. This realization gave him a strange sense of peace. His principles were not confined to crime. They were universal truths about human behavior. Power always tempted excess. Attention always invited scrutiny. Survival always favored those who moved quietly. As his world grew smaller, Torrio found comfort in predictability. He appreciated mornings that began without urgency and nights that ended without fear. For a man who once navigated constant risk, calm felt like a luxury earned through discipline. He understood that history would never fully understand him. His name would be mentioned briefly, overshadowed by louder figures and dramatic endings. And that was acceptable. Torrio had never sought recognition. Recognition complicated survival. In his final reflections of the era he helped shape, Torrio reached one conclusion. That felt absolute. The most powerful move he ever made was stepping away. Not every battle needed to be won. Not every position needed to be held. Sometimes, departure was the ultimate control. He had left behind systems, not chaos, principles, not noise. And while others fought desperately to maintain relevance, Torrio lived quietly, watching the world confirm what he had always known. In the end, Johnny Torrio was not defined by violence or ambition. He was defined by restraint, by understanding limits, by recognizing when the game no longer needed him at the table. And as the world continued to move forward, loud, impatient, and restless, he remained still, content in the knowledge that silence, when chosen wisely, could be the most enduring form of power. There comes a point in a man's life when movement gives way to stillness, not because energy has faded, but because clarity has arrived. For Johnny Torrio, that stillness became a deliberate state. He had learned that motion attracted notice, and notice attracted risk. Stillness, when chosen rather than imposed, offered protection. Torrio understood that absence itself could become a form of influence. When a powerful figure vanished without explanation, speculation filled the gap. That uncertainty restrained others. No one knew whether he was watching, advising, or preparing. In that ambiguity, Torrio found a final layer of security. He spent more time observing human behavior in its simplest forms. How people reacted when they believed no one important was watching. How they revealed ambition through impatience. How silence made some uncomfortable and others cautious. Torrio had always trusted observation more than conversation. The world around him continued to accelerate. New leaders rose quickly, driven by urgency rather than foresight. They demanded loyalty without understanding how fragile it was. Torrio saw how rapidly trust evaporated when profit alone became the glue holding alliances together. In private, he reflected on how rare true discipline had been even during his own rise. Most men, he realized, were not undone by enemies. They were undone by themselves, by talking too much, by expanding too fast, by mistaking attention for control. Torrio had never believed in destiny. He believed in probability, and probability favored those who limited exposure. He had survived, not because he was untouchable, but because he was cautious. Every choice he made had been weighed against risk, not ego. As time passed, Torrio grew increasingly detached from labels: gangster, strategist, criminal. None of them felt accurate anymore. They described actions, not mindset. Torrio's true identity had always been internal, a thinker navigating systems built by flawed people. He found interest in studying legitimate enterprises from afar. Corporations rose and fell using the same logic he had once applied to underground operations. Expansion without oversight led to collapse. Leaders surrounded themselves with agreement rather than truth. Torrio recognized these failures instantly. In his quiet reflections, he acknowledged a subtle truth. Crime had simply been a setting, not a defining trait. The lessons he learned there applied everywhere. Power required structure. Growth required restraint. Survival required humility. Occasionally, Torrio encountered individuals who spoke with reckless admiration for figures of the past. They romanticized violence, chaos, and rebellion. Torrio listened politely but felt no connection to their fascination. They were attracted to endings, not processes. He understood why myths endured. They simplified complexity. They turned cautionary lives into entertainment. Torrio had lived inside the complexity, and he knew how misleading those myths could be. As his routines became more ingrained, Torrio found comfort in repetition. Predictable days reinforced safety. He avoided surprises whenever possible. In his experience, surprises rarely benefited anyone unprepared for them. He also recognized the importance of emotional discipline. Regret, nostalgia, and pride were indulgences he could not afford. He acknowledged his past without reliving it. Dwelling served no strategic purpose. When news reached him of former associates meeting inevitable ends, prison betrayal, violence, Torrio felt no satisfaction, only confirmation. Their outcomes followed patterns he had anticipated long before stepping away. What set Torrio apart was not foresight alone, but acceptance. He accepted that control was temporary, that systems evolved beyond their creators, that stepping aside preserved life more effectively than fighting for relevance. He took no pleasure in being right. Being right did not undo loss, it only explained it. In rare moments of introspection, Torrio asked himself whether he would change anything. The answer was always the same. He would change nothing essential. Each decision had been made with the information available at the time. Survival itself validated those choices. He believed that wisdom was not the accumulation of experience, but the ability to disengage when experience no longer served purpose. Too many men clung to identity long after it endangered them. Torrio had released his identity before it consumed him. As his physical pace slowed, his awareness deepened. He noticed subtle shifts in people's behavior, the way tone changed when authority entered a room, the way fear disguised itself as confidence. These observations reassured him that the world remained fundamentally unchanged. Human nature, Torrio concluded, was remarkably consistent. Only the costumes changed. In his later years, Torrio valued invisibility above all else. To be overlooked was to be safe. To be ignored was to be free. Fame, he believed, was simply another form of confinement. He had once built an empire without demanding recognition. Now he lived without demanding explanation. Both choices stemmed from the same principle: control over one's own exposure. As nights grew quieter and thoughts slowed, Torrio rested with unusual sense of closure, not because his past was resolved, but because it no longer demanded his attention. He had stepped out of the current and allowed it to flow without him. Johnny Torrio did not measure his life by power held or enemies defeated. He measured it by distance gained from danger, from chaos, from unnecessary noise. And in that distance, he found something far rarer than dominance. He found peace. As the world moved further away from the era that had shaped him, Johnny Torrio became increasingly aware of how memory reshapes reality. Events once sharp and urgent softened at the edges, not because they lost importance, but because time filtered out emotion. What remained were lessons, clean, precise, and undeniable. Torrio no longer measured days by outcomes or decisions. Instead, he measured them by absence of disturbance. Silence meant safety. Routine meant control. Each uneventful day confirmed that his most strategic move had not been expansion, negotiation, or withdrawal but restraint. He had come to believe that the loudest chapters of any life were rarely the most meaningful. Noise distracted from structure. Drama obscured cause and effect. Torrio valued the quiet stretches where nothing demanded reaction. In those moments, he felt closest to clarity. He watched the next generation misunderstand power entirely. They chased visibility, believing it equaled influence. Torrio knew better. Influence did not announce itself. It moved quietly, often unnoticed, shaping outcomes long before anyone realized what had changed. In his solitude, Torrio reflected on the nature of leadership. True leaders, he believed, were defined not by how many followed them, but by how well their systems functioned in their absence. By that measure, Torrio considered his work complete. He had built something that did not collapse the moment he stepped away. Others had dismantled it slowly through impatience and ego, but that was inevitable. Systems survive people, not the other way around. As age deepened his introspection, Torrio became less interested in legacy and more interested in understanding patterns. He saw the same cycles repeat across different arenas: crime, politics, business, rise through innovation, growth through opportunity, decline through excess. He understood that most people never recognized where they were in the cycle. They mistook growth for permanence. Torrio had never made that mistake. From the beginning, he assumed decline was inevitable and planned accordingly. This assumption freed him. It allowed him to act without illusion. He never believed he was building something eternal. He was building something functional for a time. Torrio found a strange comfort in that honesty. There was no disappointment when things ended as expected. Only confirmation. He spent time thinking about the cost of ambition. Ambition, he concluded, was not dangerous by itself. What made it dangerous was impatience. When ambition demanded immediate reward, it destroyed judgment. Torrio had always delayed gratification. He avoided dramatic gestures. He preferred slow accumulation over sudden victory. That patience had shielded him when others fell. He remembered how often people mistook kindness for weakness, politeness for submission. Torrio had allowed those misconceptions to exist because correcting them offered no advantage. Underestimation, he believed, was a useful condition. Even now, removed from relevance, Torrio noticed how people revealed themselves through urgency. Those who rushed spoke too much. Those who paused listened more. He had always chosen to pause. The world he observed no longer resembled the one he had navigated. Laws had changed. Technology accelerated communication. Information traveled faster than intention. Yet despite these changes, human behavior remained stubbornly consistent. Fear still drove decisions. Pride still blinded judgment. Silence still unsettled those who depended on validation. Torrio accepted that he would never fully understand why some men needed to be seen. The desire for recognition had always puzzled him. To Torrio, recognition created obligation. Obligation created exposure. Exposure created risk. He preferred autonomy, and autonomy required distance. In quiet moments, he revisited the concept of power not as authority, but as freedom of choice. True power, he realized, was the ability to walk away without consequence, to refuse engagement without penalty, to exist without explanation. That was the power he now possessed. Torrio had learned that life rarely rewarded those who demanded control. It rewarded those who adapted to its absence. Flexibility, not force, ensured survival. As his days grew increasingly reflective, Torrio felt no urgency to impart wisdom. Advice, he believed, was rarely heard unless requested. And those who requested it were already inclined to understand. Instead, he lived as example rather than instructor, quietly, consistently, without announcement. He took satisfaction in knowing that his survival defied expectation. In a world where endings were often violent in public, his was calm and private. That outcome, he believed, was the clearest evidence of strategic success. He had never sought redemption or justification. He accepted responsibility without dramatization. The past was neither glorified nor denied. It simply existed. In his final reflections of that long journey, Torrio reached a conclusion that felt complete. The most dangerous belief any person could hold was the belief that they mattered more than the system around them. Once a man understood the truth, he could act intelligently or step aside gracefully. Johnny Torrio had chosen the latter, and in doing so, he had accomplished what few ever managed in his world. He had left on his own terms, carried forward not by noise or myth, but by the quiet endurance of a mind that understood when to stop. There is a particular kind of wisdom that only distance can provide. Johnny Torrio had earned that distance through deliberate restraint. Long removed from the currents that once demanded constant vigilance, he now observed the world with a steadiness that came from having nothing left to prove. What intrigued Torrio most in these later years was not the downfall of individuals but the persistence of patterns. Men rose quickly, fueled by confidence and opportunity. They expanded faster than they could control. They mistook momentum for mastery. Torrio recognized each stage with quiet certainty. He had seen it all before, only with different names and different streets. He understood that most people never truly sought power. What they sought was reassurance. Power was simply the illusion that promised certainty in an unpredictable world. Torrio had never believed in that illusion. He accepted uncertainty as a constant and planned within it rather than against it. This acceptance shaped every choice he made. It allowed him to remain calm while others panicked. It allowed him to step aside while others clung desperately to relevance. Torrio believed that the inability to let go was the true weakness that destroyed men. In moments of reflection, he revisited decisions not with regret, but with curiosity. He examined outcomes not to relive them, but to understand their mechanics. Strategy, to Torrio, had always been less about winning and more about understanding why something worked or failed. He noticed how often people ignored early warning signs. Small disruptions dismissed as temporary inconveniences, minor betrayals rationalized away. Torrio had always paid attention to those details. He believed collapse announced itself long before it arrived. In his own life, the warning signs had been clear: escalating violence, growing attention, shifting loyalties. He had responded not with escalation but with withdrawal. That choice, simple as it seemed, had preserved his life. As time passed, Torrio became more convinced that success was less about intelligence than about timing. Acting too early invited resistance. Acting too late invited disaster. The narrow space in between was where survival lived. He had spent years operating within that space, adjusting constantly, never settling into comfort. Comfort, he believed, dulled perception. Once a man felt secure, he stopped listening. Torrio had never stopped listening. Even now, removed from the center of events, he listened to tone, to implication, to what remained unsaid. He believed truth rarely announced itself directly. It revealed itself in pauses, hesitations, and contradictions. The world around him continued to change rapidly. New technologies reshaped communication. Information moved faster than thought. Torrio observed how speed eroded judgment. Decisions made too quickly left no room for consequence. He believed patience was becoming obsolete, replaced by urgency and reaction. That concerned him, though not personally. He had already positioned himself beyond the reach of such volatility. In rare conversations, Torrio noticed how often people spoke without reflection. Words poured out as if silence were a threat. Torrio had always embraced silence. Silence created space. Space allowed thought. He recalled how many negotiations had been won simply by listening longer than the other side expected. People revealed more than they intended when given time. Torrio had built entire strategies on that principle. As age deepened his sense of detachment, Torrio found satisfaction in simplicity. He no longer measured worth by accumulation. Possessions were burdens. Obligations were risks. Freedom required lightness. He reduced his life to essentials: routine, discretion, and autonomy. Everything else was unnecessary. Torrio also understood that memory itself was a form of exposure. Dwelling on the past invited questions. Questions invited attention. Attention invited danger. He allowed memories to pass through him without attachment. The past existed, but it did not define the present. That separation was intentional. In moments of honesty, Torrio acknowledged that fear had played a role in his choices, but not the fear others imagined. He had never feared enemies as much as he feared stagnation. Being trapped by one's own identity was, to him, the greatest risk of all. He had watched too many men become prisoners of reputation. They behaved not according to strategy, but according to expectation. Torrio refused that trap. He had changed roles before others could confine him to one. As the years accumulated quietly, Torrio sensed a growing stillness within himself. Not exhaustion, but resolution. There was nothing left to calculate. Nothing left to escape. He had already navigated away from danger. He took no pride in survival, but he respected it. Survival, in his world, was not accidental. It was earned through restraint, foresight, and humility. He believed that humility was the most misunderstood trait of all. It was not weakness, but awareness. Awareness of limits. Awareness of consequence. Awareness that no position was permanent. That awareness had guided him when ambition tempted him to expand further. It had guided him when violence threatened to spiral beyond control. It guided him now as he lived quietly, unnoticed, and unburdened. Johnny Torrio had once shaped the flow of power without demanding acknowledgement. Now he shaped his own days with the same discipline. In the end, he understood something few ever did. The goal was never to dominate the game, but to leave it intact enough to walk away from. And as nights settled gently around him, free of urgency or threat, Torrio rested in the rare knowledge that he had chosen the hardest path, the path of restraint, and survived it. With the passing of years came a quieter kind of strength, one that did not rely on presence or influence, but on acceptance. Johnny Torrio had learned that the greatest advantage of time was not distance from danger, but distance from illusion. The illusions of control, permanence, and importance had faded, leaving behind a clear and manageable reality. He no longer followed events closely, not because they lacked relevance, but because relevance itself had changed meaning. What once demanded attention now unfolded without consequence to his life. This separation was not indifference, it was freedom. Torrio had reached a stage where reaction was no longer required. In his quieter routines, Torrio reflected on how often people confused activity with purpose. He had once moved constantly, but every movement had been deliberate. Now, stillness carried the same intention. Both were tools. Neither defined him. He understood that people often feared emptiness, mistaking it for loss. Torrio saw it differently. Emptiness was space. Space allowed choice. Choice allowed autonomy. In a life once crowded by obligation, space was the rarest luxury. He observed how men, still operating within systems, struggled against the weight of expectation. They were expected to respond, to retaliate, to assert dominance. Torrio had stepped outside that expectation long ago. In doing so, he had escaped its demands. One of the quiet realizations that settled with age was how little force truly mattered. Force created reaction. Reaction created cycles. Torrio had spent his life minimizing cycles, not fueling them. He believed that the most effective action was often non-action. This belief had guided his withdrawal. He had not disappeared in haste or fear. He had faded deliberately, allowing curiosity to die out naturally. People lost interest when there was nothing to react to. Torrio had counted on that. As time went on, his name surfaced less frequently, eventually becoming just another reference, stripped of immediacy. That was precisely what he wanted. Memory without urgency posed no threat. Torrio found himself increasingly fascinated by how people narrated their own lives. They emphasized triumphs and dramatized struggles, often ignoring the quiet decisions that truly shaped outcomes. Torrio knew that the most important choices were usually the least dramatic. He remembered how often restraint had saved him without anyone noticing, how choosing not to act had prevented conflicts before they began, how silence had diffused tensions words could not. Those moments had never appeared in headlines or conversation. They existed only as absences, events that never happened, because they had been prevented. Torrio valued those invisible victories more than any public success. As he aged, Torrio recognized another truth. Most people did not fail because they lacked opportunity. They failed because they lacked patience. They rushed conclusions. They demanded certainty. They refused to wait. Torrio had always waited. Waiting allowed information to surface. It allowed emotions to settle. It allowed others to reveal their intentions. Torrio had built entire strategies around letting others move first. In his later years, waiting became a way of life rather than a tactic. He waited without expectation. He observed without judgment. He lived without urgency. The world outside continued accelerating, driven by immediacy and exposure. Torrio saw how speed reduced nuance. Decisions made quickly left no room for correction. Errors compounded faster than they could be addressed. He felt no desire to engage with that pace. He had already completed his movement through it. What remained was understanding. In rare moments when he considered his past role, Torrio did so without pride or shame. He viewed it as a function of circumstance and ability. He had been suited to that environment at that time. When he was no longer suited, he left. This acceptance freed him from regret. Regret required attachment. Torrio had released attachment. He believed that many people misunderstood strength. Strength to Torrio was not endurance alone. It was the willingness to change direction when conditions demanded it. Rigidity destroyed more men than weakness ever did. As his life continued quietly, Torrio felt increasingly comfortable with obscurity. To be unknown was to be unrestricted. He could move without recognition, speak without consequence, exist without explanation. That anonymity was not emptiness, it was completion. He found satisfaction in knowing that his survival contradicted expectations. Many had assumed his story would end violently or publicly. Instead, it ended gradually, privately, and on his own terms. In a world where endings were often forced, Torrio had chosen his. He understood that people often search for meaning in conclusions. Torrio found meaning in continuity. Life continued because it was allowed to. That in itself was success. As nights grew longer and quieter, Torrio welcomed rest without fear. He had no unfinished calculations, no unresolved conflicts demanding attention. Everything that could be controlled had been addressed. Everything else had been released. Johnny Torrio had once navigated danger with precision and foresight. Now he navigated stillness with the same discipline. And in that stillness, he discovered the final confirmation of a life lived strategically. Not dominance, not recognition, but the rare privilege of calm. Time revealed the subtle contours of survival more clearly than power ever could. Johnny Torrio had long since distanced himself from the currents of influence, yet he remained fascinated by the forces that moved the world, forces he once navigated with precision and foresight. He no longer acted within them, but understanding them provided a quiet satisfaction that action never could. The streets and corridors he once commanded now belonged to men untested in patience. Their ambitions burned brighter than their understanding. Torrio watched from afar as they overreached, chasing visibility and immediate profit, mistaking momentum for mastery. He saw the patterns clearly. Alliances formed and shattered with astonishing speed, loyalty sold for convenience, ambition outpacing strategy. It was a world alive with energy but fragile in its foundation. He reflected on how much of life was a sequence of choices, most invisible to the casual observer. Small decisions: where to invest, whom to trust, when to speak, when to remain silent, had determined his survival as much as any daring maneuver. The headlines and stories often highlighted the drama, but they never captured the quiet calculations that actually shaped outcomes. Those unseen choices were the true architecture of power, the invisible scaffolding that held empires together. Torrio understood that the concept of control was largely an illusion. No system remained intact forever, no alliance unbroken, no network invulnerable. What survived was the awareness to navigate change, to anticipate consequences, and to act only when the cost was acceptable. He had always been more concerned with the probabilities than the appearances, more with endurance than glory. He recalled moments from decades earlier, when the balance between risk and reward had been delicate. One misstep, one misjudged personality, one lapse in discipline could have ended everything. Survival required constant awareness, and an ability to adapt silently. And adapt he had every time circumstances threatened to overwhelm him. Torrio relied not on brute force, but on foresight, discretion, and patience. It was a method that few understood, and even fewer could replicate. In these years of quiet observation, Torrio began to appreciate the patterns of human behavior with renewed clarity. Fear was universal. Pride was persistent. Desire for recognition was relentless. Men acted predictably when under pressure, revealing their priorities before anyone noticed. He realized that understanding these impulses had always been more powerful than controlling events directly. He noticed the subtle difference between ambition and wisdom. Ambition without discipline led to reckless actions and inevitable downfall. Wisdom required restraint, foresight, and sometimes the courage to disengage. Torrio had chosen that path consistently, and it had preserved him in a world where so many others had faltered. Even in his seclusion, Torrio maintained a careful awareness of developments in his former world. He observed conflicts that had once seemed urgent, now unfolding without his intervention. He noticed the consequences of decisions made in haste, the collapse of empire built on impulsive choices, the decline of those who mistook fear for loyalty. Each incident confirmed what he had long known. Survival demanded strategic thought, patience, and the willingness to step aside when necessary. He often reflected on the nature of legacy. Legacy, he realized, was less about recognition and more about continuity. Those who clung to visibility often undermined the very structures that could have supported them. True influence was measured not by headlines or public perception, but by the stability and endurance of the systems one left behind. By that measure, Torrio's impact remained profound, though invisible to most observers. As he moved through his daily routines, Torrio found satisfaction in the mundane. He appreciated the predictability of a life no longer dictated by urgency or danger. Meals were simple. Walks were deliberate. Conversations were sparse and intentional. In the absence of chaos, he discovered a new kind of clarity, one that allowed reflection without distraction. He also spent time contemplating the limits of human understanding. Most people believed that power was about possession, yet he knew it was about timing, perception, and the management of probability. Those who assumed control required visibility and engagement often overextended themselves. Those who understood timing could act decisively or choose not to act at all, with consequences far more enduring. In this quiet period, Torrio recognized the role of observation in survival, listening carefully, noting patterns, interpreting subtle signals. These were the tools that had kept him alive and effective. The loudest voices often revealed the least, while silence frequently carried the most information. Patience was not passive. It was an active form of engagement, one that required discipline and awareness. He thought about the unpredictability of circumstance. No matter how carefully one calculated, unforeseen events could always intrude. Yet the disciplined mind minimized vulnerability by preparing for multiple possibilities. Torrio had always embraced this approach, and it allowed him to navigate dangerous environments with composure. He knew that adaptability, rather than force or notoriety, was the true measure of strength. In rare moments, he allowed himself to consider what might have been if he had acted differently. But these reflections were analytical rather than emotional. He evaluated past decisions as a strategist might assess a completed project, noting where judgment was sound, where caution had succeeded, where chance had intervened. Regret played no part in this assessment. Understanding did. Torrio also observed how society, in general, mirrored the dynamics of the underworld he had once inhabited. Ambition often outpaced prudence, and visibility frequently invited scrutiny. Those who sought rapid expansion, without regard for consequence, often fell first. Patterns repeated themselves across industries, institutions, and generations, reinforcing lessons he had long internalized. He found a subtle contentment in recognizing that human behavior, despite the passage of time and the evolution of circumstance, remained remarkably consistent. Desire, fear, ambition, and pride were constants. The details changed, but the underlying mechanics did not. Awareness of these patterns had guided his life, and continued observation now confirmed their persistence. Johnny Torrio had once navigated a world of danger with careful precision. He had built structures that endured beyond his direct involvement. He had learned when to act, and more importantly, when to step back. In the quiet of later years, away from chaos and urgency, he realized that survival and understanding were achievements in themselves. Not every life could be marked by drama or notoriety. Some were defined by foresight, patience, and the quiet endurance of calculated choices. And as he rested in that understanding, removed from expectation, free from pressure, he experienced a satisfaction that few could comprehend, the rare privilege of witnessing the world continue its patterns, while knowing that the principles which had guided him still endured silently, shaping outcomes without fanfare or recognition. The quiet of later life offered Johnny Torrio a perspective few men ever achieve. Johnny Torrio understood now that time distilled truth more effectively than experience alone. The noise of ambition, the clamoring for recognition, the fleeting intensity of power, all of it fell away when observed from a distance, leaving patterns, probabilities, and consequences in sharp relief. He had built a life around anticipating these patterns, and now, removed from urgency, he could watch them unfold without the constant pressure of decision. Torrio reflected on how much of human behavior was predictable when viewed correctly. People responded to incentives, rewards, and threats in ways that were often instinctual, not rational. They overestimated their control and underestimated randomness. They sought immediate outcomes without considering long-term consequences. He had long since internalized these truths, and his survival owed as much to understanding human psychology as it did to strategic thinking. He thought about the men he had known, those who had risen rapidly, believing in their invincibility. He remembered how ambition, when combined with impatience, often led to destruction. In his youth, he had been surrounded by violence and chaos, yet he had chosen caution over bravado. That discipline had set him apart. Other men rushed into danger, seeking glory, while he built systems that required observation, analysis, and precision. In these reflections, Torrio realized the significance of restraint. Most of his contemporaries equated action with success, visibility with influence, and confrontation with authority. He had learned early that the opposite was often true. Silence protected more effectively than threats. Withdrawal preserved more reliably than confrontation. He had practiced restraint not out of fear, but out of calculation, and it had become a principle that defined his life. Even in retirement, he maintained the mindset of a strategist. Observation remained active, not passive. He noted shifts in the behavior of others, fluctuations in economic and social trends, and the subtle consequences of decisions made without foresight. He saw patterns repeat themselves across generations in business, politics, and society at large. The same mistakes emerged again and again: impatience, overreach, miscalculation. Awareness of these cycles had once saved his life. Now it provided insight without obligation. Torrio reflected on the nature of control. People often equated it with authority, with the ability to command others or dictate outcomes. He understood that true control was subtler. It lay in anticipation, in creating conditions that allow desired outcomes to occur without constant intervention. It lay in the careful structuring of systems that function independently of ego or impulse. And most importantly, it lay in knowing when to remove oneself from the equation entirely. He recalled the decisions that had defined him. They were not dramatic confrontations, spectacular victories, or flashy maneuvers. They were small, deliberate choices made quietly and consistently. Who to trust, when to act, when to speak, when to stay silent. Each choice accumulated, creating layers of protection and influence that few could see, fewer could comprehend, and almost no one could dismantle. That accumulation had been invisible, yet it had been decisive. In his reflections, Torrio also contemplated the concept of timing. Timing had dictated outcomes more than force or cunning. Acting too early invited resistance. Acting too late invited disaster. Recognizing the narrow space between the two had been central to his survival. The wisdom of waiting, observing, and then moving decisively was a principle he had internalized early and applied consistently. It had preserved him when others fell. The world had changed around him, but human nature remained stubbornly consistent. Greed, pride, fear, and ambition continued to drive behavior. The details evolved, but the mechanics were the same. Torrio found reassurance in that constancy. It validated the strategies he had long practiced and the principles he had adhered to, not for fame, not for recognition, but simply for survival. He thought about reputation and legacy. Most men sought them obsessively, measuring success by how loudly their names were spoken. Torrio, however, valued endurance over applause. A quiet, effective influence that outlasted attention was far more powerful than any fleeting public recognition. He had built his life accordingly, focusing on creating systems and conditions that endured, rather than seeking transient validation. In his solitude, Torrio also reflected on the cost of human error. He had witnessed countless lives unravel due to impatience, impulsiveness, or misplaced trust. Even the most powerful figures often failed because they underestimated complexity or overestimated themselves. Torrio understood the inevitability of error, and he had designed his decisions to mitigate its impact. Anticipation, observation, and restraint had been his tools, and they had proven remarkably effective. Even removed from the frenetic energy of his earlier years, Torrio continued to apply the same analytical lens to the world. He observed markets, legal systems, and social structures, noting how incentives shaped behavior, how small decisions accumulated into large consequences, and how cycles repeated across different contexts. That perspective, honed over decades of experience, allowed him to understand the world more clearly than those immersed in its immediate chaos. He reflected on the principle of survival, which had guided his entire life. Survival was not simply living longer. It was navigating complexity with clarity and calm. It was recognizing when to act, and just as importantly, when to withdraw. It was balancing patience and initiative, observation and intervention. Torrio had lived according to these principles, and they had preserved him when so many others had succumbed. Johnny Torrio also considered the nature of power itself. True power was not visibility or fear. It was subtle, often unseen. It was the ability to influence outcomes without attracting attention. It was the capacity to anticipate, adapt, and endure. Throughout his life, Torrio had exercised this power quietly, deliberately, and with precision. That quiet power, more than any public display, had shaped his legacy and ensured his survival. In the stillness of later years, Torrio finally felt the rare satisfaction of completion. He had navigated a life of immense danger with foresight, discipline, and patience. He had built structures that endured without requiring constant attention. He had understood human behavior in ways that few ever could, and he had withdrawn from danger at precisely the right time, preserving both his life and the lessons he had accumulated. As night fell, bringing quiet to the world around him, Torrio experienced the calm that comes from understanding, foresight, and careful navigation. He rested not because the world demanded it, but because he had earned it. His life, defined by careful observation, strategic restraint, and patient calculation, had reached a stage of clarity and peace that few could imagine. And in that quiet, Johnny Torrio knew, without need for acknowledgement or applause, that he had lived as he had intended, with foresight, patience, and the rare wisdom of knowing when to act and when to step away. As the years settled around him, Johnny Torrio discovered that time offered a perspective few ever achieved. Johnny Torrio had long since withdrawn from the frenzied world of influence and ambition, and in that withdrawal he found clarity. The patterns of human behavior, once immediate and pressing, now unfolded before him like a carefully arranged map. He could see the cause and effect of decisions, the repetition of errors, and the subtle impact of restraint on outcomes. In quiet reflection, he understood what few living men ever recognized. Power is fleeting, but understanding endures. He observed how impatience continued to drive men, how the pursuit of recognition overshadowed prudence, and how ambition often blinded those who believed themselves capable of controlling circumstances. People rushed to act, seeking to leave their mark, yet in doing so, they often dismantled the structures they inherited. Torrio had long avoided that trap. He had learned that restraint, observation, and timing often achieved more than force or spectacle. He thought about the subtle mechanics of survival. It was not the dramatic confrontations, the explosive victories, or the public displays that defined endurance. It was the careful decisions made in moments that others overlooked, choosing the right associates, understanding motivations, observing behavior, and remaining patient. All of these were invisible acts that accumulated into lasting advantage. Torrio had practiced these principles consistently, and the quiet success of his later life was evidence of their effectiveness. Even as he lived removed from the center of action, he remained deeply attuned to human nature. Fear and ambition remained constants, as did pride and the craving for recognition. These forces shaped behavior in predictable ways. Men reacted to pressure with instinct, often overestimating their control and underestimating the consequences. Torrio had spent decades interpreting these impulses, and the clarity that came from understanding them now brought a kind of peace. He also reflected on the concept of control. Most believed it resided in visibility, authority, or public recognition. Torrio had learned the contrary. True control was subtle. It was in structuring circumstances so that outcomes occur without the need for constant intervention. It was in recognizing when action was necessary, and when the wisest choice was to withdraw. By exercising influence quietly, without attracting attention, he had maintained power and preserved life. In his quiet routines, Torrio found satisfaction in observation and reflection. His mornings began predictably, his steps deliberate, his thoughts methodical. Every movement was conscious, not because necessity demanded it, but because discipline had become a part of him. Even in retirement, his mind operated as a strategist, evaluating, understanding, and anticipating. He analyzed events not for immediate gain, but to maintain perspective and insight. He contemplated the nature of legacy, which many men chased obsessively, yet often misunderstood. Torrio realized that true legacy was not in fame or notoriety, but in the endurance of systems, subtle shaping of outcomes, and the quiet influence that persisted after one had stepped aside. Those who sought recognition above all else frequently undermined the very stability that could have preserved their influence. Torrio had avoided that error entirely. His influence endured not through stories or headlines, but through the structures he had built and the wisdom he had imparted silently. He remembered the men who had fallen around him, victims of haste, overconfidence, or misjudgment. Their outcomes were never surprising. They followed patterns he had long anticipated, yet most ignored warning signs. Torrio understood the cost of error, and he had structured his life to mitigate it. Timing, observation, and restraint were as critical as courage, intelligence, or force. He had learned this lesson repeatedly and applied it consistently. Even now, he observed these patterns outside the world he had once dominated. Business, politics, society. Decisions made without patience or foresight led to predictable outcomes. Growth without oversight invited collapse. Ambition without strategy invited destruction. The principles that had guided his life were universal, transcending the boundaries of crime and applying to all human systems. He also reflected on the concept of reputation. Most men equated visibility with strength and public acknowledgement with power. Torrio had long understood the opposite. True strength was often invisible, operating quietly, unseen and uncelebrated. Survival, adaptability, and insight mattered far more than recognition. The ability to act or choose not to act at the right moment was the essence of control. In solitude, Torrio contemplated the nature of human error further. Even the most intelligent and ambitious men made mistakes, often because they overestimated their own foresight. Those who moved quickly without careful observation rarely survived. Torrio had always relied on patience and calculated responses. He understood that the world rewarded preparation more than aggression, and that endurance was achieved not through force, but through insight and adaptability. He found a subtle satisfaction in knowing that his life had been structured around observation rather than reaction, foresight rather than impulsiveness. Every step, every choice, had been deliberate. He had built not only systems that endured, but also a personal philosophy that allowed him to survive in a world where so many others had perished. As he reflected on the past, Torrio recognized the rare privilege of being able to watch life unfold without being consumed by it. He had once been in the center of danger, yet through restraint, foresight, and calculation, he had navigated its currents successfully. Now, removed from necessity, he could see the consequences of decisions played out in real time, confirming the validity of the principles that had guided him. Johnny Torrio had lived a life defined by strategy, patience, and awareness. He had understood the nature of human behavior, anticipated its repetitions, and adapted accordingly. Survival was not the product of strength or aggression alone, it was the outcome of understanding, timing, and disciplined restraint. And in his later years, removed from chaos and drama, Torrio experienced the rare satisfaction of witnessing the world continue its patterns while knowing that his principles, quietly and invisibly, had endured. Time, for Johnny Torrio, had become less a sequence of events and more a lens through which to observe patterns, probabilities, and human behavior. Johnny Torrio had long since withdrawn from the frenetic world influence and danger, yet his mind remained as active and discerning as ever. He understood now that the essence of survival and impact was not visibility, confrontation, or immediate reward. It was the mastery of perception, timing, and restraint. He observed the world around him with the patience cultivated over decades, noting how ambition and impatience frequently undermine success. Men rose quickly, fueled by confidence and desire, only to stumble because they acted before fully understanding the consequences. They misjudged loyalty, underestimated risk, and overestimated their own influence. Torrio had navigated that landscape precisely because he understood these dynamics. Observation, he realized, was far more potent than action when used effectively. In the quiet of his days, he reflected on the subtle mechanics of influence. True power, he knew, rarely required display. It operated beneath the surface, shaping outcomes quietly, subtly, without attracting attention. Decisions that appeared inconsequential often had the greatest effect, and the careful management of those decisions determined longevity more than any overt act of dominance. Torrio had mastered this principle early, and it had preserved his life when others fell victim to impulsive behavior. He remembered how often restraint had been misinterpreted as weakness. People equated silence with submission and patience with indecision, failing to recognize that those qualities were deliberate, strategic, and profoundly effective. Torrio had long exploited the perceptions of others, allowing assumption to obscure his intentions, thereby gaining leverage without confrontation. The efficiency of this approach had become more apparent with each passing year. The principles he applied were universal, extending beyond the realm of organized crime. He observed businesses collapsing from overexpansion, politicians undermined by hasty decisions, and leaders undone by overconfidence. Each misstep mirrored patterns he had witnessed countless times before. Human behavior remained consistent even as circumstance changed. Greed, pride, fear, and desire continued to shape actions in ways that were predictable when viewed through the lens of experience. Torrio reflected on the nature of decision-making. Most people approach choices with urgency, often seeking immediate results at the expense of long-term stability. He had always understood that the most impactful decisions were those made with careful deliberation, tempered by observation and a recognition of probability. Timing, foresight, and restraint were more decisive than force, visibility, or aggression. Those who lacked patience often revealed their vulnerabilities before they even recognized them. He also contemplated the notion of risk. Risk was inherent in every action, yet it was not the risk itself that determined outcome. It was the management of risk. Torrio had built a life around minimizing exposure to unnecessary danger while maintaining influence over essential outcomes. His survival had depended on this awareness, and in later years he appreciated the subtlety with which risk could be observed, analyzed, and navigated without overt engagement. Even in solitude, Torrio's mind remained attuned to the interplay of relationships, incentives, and human nature. He recognized how alliances could shift suddenly, how loyalty often depended on immediate advantage rather than principle, and how perception could be as powerful as reality. Observing without participating allowed him to understand these dynamics without the distortions introduced by ego or attachment. He considered how many men misunderstood power. They equated visibility, force, or recognition with control, failing to grasp that true authority often operated invisibly. The ability to influence outcomes without attracting notice, to anticipate changes before they occurred, and to act or refrain from acting with precision was the true measure of strength. Torrio had applied this understanding consistently, and it had preserved his autonomy in life. When many around him had fallen, reflection also brought him insight into the psychology of survival. Fear, ambition, pride, and impatience were constants in human behavior, but their manifestation could be predicted and managed. Recognizing patterns of behavior, understanding incentives, and anticipating emotional responses had always given him an advantage over others. These insights were not innate. They were cultivated through careful observation, analysis, and experience. He often considered the consequences of human error. Even highly capable men failed because they acted too quickly, trusted too easily, or overestimated their influence. Torrio had built his life to avoid such pitfalls. He structured his decisions to minimize exposure, relying on patience, discretion, and strategic withdrawal. These methods had preserved his life, and in later years, he appreciated their continued relevance even as the world changed around him. In his quiet moments, he reflected on legacy, not the fame or notoriety that many sought, but the enduring impact of decisions made wisely. True legacy, he believed, was found in the stability and resilience of systems left behind, in the unseen influence exerted over outcomes, and in the knowledge that one had acted deliberately rather than impulsively. Torrio's life exemplified this principle. Though largely unrecognized, his influence endured through the structure, strategies, and lessons embedded in the world he had once navigated. Johnny Torrio also contemplated mortality with clarity rather than fear. He had lived a life of risk, foresight, and restraint, and now, removed from immediate danger, he could appreciate the culmination of his strategies and principles. Survival, he understood, was not merely the absence of death but the outcome of disciplined thought, careful action, and measured response. That understanding provided a profound sense of peace. Even as the world continued to evolve, Torrio remained observant, noting patterns in human behavior, shifts in society, and the consequences of decisions made without foresight. He recognized that the principles guiding human action were remarkably consistent, regardless of era or circumstance. Observation, restraint, patience, and calculated decision-making remain timeless tools for understanding and navigating complexity. In these later years, he found contentment in the quiet consistency of his principles. The world around him moved with energy, ambition, and occasional recklessness, but Torrio observed without urgency. He had stepped away from the fray not from fear, but from wisdom. Distance provided perspective, and perspective offered insight into the predictable cycles of human behavior, the consequences of impulsive action, and the enduring value of patience. Johnny Torrio had built his life around foresight, discipline, and observation. He had understood patterns that others ignored, anticipated outcomes that others could not, and acted with restraint when impulse would have demanded action. In the quiet of his later years, he reflected on a life shaped by careful calculation and strategic patience. He had navigated danger, influence, and human ambition with clarity and insight, and now, removed from immediate concern, he experienced the satisfaction of understanding the world as it unfolded, predictable, complex, and entirely consistent with the principles that had guided him. Time had a way of clarifying what urgency often obscured, and Johnny Torrio understood this better than most. Johnny Torrio had spent decades navigating a world defined by rapid decisions, concealed motives, and constant risk. Now, in the quiet of his later years, he could see the entire landscape with a precision that only distance and reflection could provide. The patterns of human behavior, once shrouded in immediacy and danger, now revealed themselves in slow, deliberate rhythm, as if the world itself had paused to allow observation. He found himself increasingly fascinated by the psychology of ambition. Ambition, he observed, often drove men toward choices they were ill-prepared to make. They acted quickly, seeking recognition, assuming that control was equivalent to power. Torrio had learned early that this assumption was flawed. Real power was subtle, operating beneath the surface, shaping outcomes without drawing attention. He had exercised this power quietly, influencing events and people without the need for spectacle. Observation, patience, and timing had been his tools. Torrio reflected on the subtle dynamics of influence. Many men equated action with effectiveness, visibility with authority, and confrontation with control. He had learned to invert these assumptions. Stillness, he realized, was often more powerful than movement, silence more revealing than speech. The careful structuring of circumstances, combined with discreet action, allowed him to achieve outcomes that others assumed were impossible. It was a lesson rarely acknowledged, yet profoundly effective. He also considered the cost of impulsive decisions. History, he observed, was filled with men undone by haste, overconfidence, and misjudged loyalty. They moved too quickly, trusted too readily, or misread the intentions of others. Torrio had avoided these pitfalls by cultivating patience and observation. He recognized that timing, more than force, often dictated outcomes, and that withdrawal, when chosen deliberately, could be a powerful act of strategy. In his quiet reflections, Torrio noticed how perception shaped reality. Many men acted not on facts but on assumptions about what others believed, creating cycles of behavior that often led to predictable consequences. He had long exploited these cycles, allowing others' misperceptions to create advantage. By shaping expectations rather than responding to them directly, he achieved outcomes with minimal confrontation. That subtle mastery had been central to both his influence and his survival. He contemplated the universality of human behavior. Greed, fear, pride, and ambition were constants, recurring in every generation and context. The specifics of circumstance changed, but the underlying drivers remained remarkably consistent. Torrio's understanding of these drivers had guided his actions for decades, allowing him to anticipate moves, mitigate risks, and navigate a world filled with uncertainty and danger. Observation and pattern recognition had proven more reliable than raw strength or notoriety. Torrio also reflected on the distinction between control and dominance. Dominance, he noted, relied on visibility and confrontation, often provoking resistance. Control, by contrast, required subtlety, discretion, and foresight. It allowed influence without exposure, shaping outcomes without inviting retaliation. His life had been an exercise in control, carefully calibrated to minimize risk while maximizing effectiveness. Withdrawal, patience, and observation had been as critical to his strategy as any action he had taken. He considered the failures of others, noting how often they arose from overestimation of influence or underestimation of complexity. Men assumed permanence where there was none, acted without adequate information, and allowed ego to override judgment. Torrio had consistently avoided these errors, structuring his decisions around awareness, foresight, and contingency. Even removed from immediate danger, he appreciated the continued relevance of these principles. In moments of introspection, Torrio examined his own decision-making processes. He understood that discipline, timing, and observation were not innate traits but skills honed through experience and deliberate reflection. They required vigilance, humility, and the willingness to disengage when circumstances demanded it. He recognized that most men failed not from lack of intelligence but from impatience and inability to observe carefully. The principle of restraint had guided him more than any display of strength. Torrio had learned that action without context often led to vulnerability, while deliberate withdrawal and careful observation provided leverage, preserved life, and shaped outcomes indirectly. He had mastered the delicate balance between engagement and detachment, recognizing that influence was most durable when exercised subtly and invisibly. He also reflected on the role of risk. Every choice carried potential consequences, but risk itself was not inherently dangerous. It became dangerous only when unacknowledged or mismanaged. Torrio had spent a lifetime assessing risk, measuring probability, and acting only when circumstances aligned favorably. That discipline, combined with patience, had allowed him to survive environments that had destroyed countless others. Torrio found satisfaction in recognizing the universality of these principles. Whether in business, politics, or human interaction, the patterns he had studied and applied continued to manifest. Impulsive action undermined success, while observation and patience facilitated it. Ego distorted judgment, while humility clarified perception. These lessons, learned in the crucible of a dangerous and unpredictable world, were timeless. He also contemplated the fleeting nature of reputation. Most men pursued recognition obsessively, equating public acknowledgement with success. Torrio understood that true influence did not require validation. It operated quietly, shaping outcomes and preserving autonomy without drawing attention. He had built a life around this principle, valuing endurance and subtlety over spectacle. In solitude, Torrio appreciated the rare clarity that came from withdrawal. Freed from the urgency of others' expectations, he could observe, analyze, and understand without interference. The cycles of human behavior revealed themselves more clearly. The consequences of action and inaction unfolded predictably, and the subtle mechanics of influence became evident. Observation, patience, and timing had proven their enduring value. Johnny Torrio had spent decades navigating a world defined by risk, ambition, and uncertainty. He had built influence quietly, exercised restraint deliberately, and observed human behavior with care. Even in the later years of his life, removed from immediate danger, he continued to witness the same patterns, confirming the principles that had guided him. His survival and understanding were the culmination of discipline, foresight, and the deliberate exercise of restraint. A life structured not around notoriety or power alone, but around the enduring mastery of observation and strategy. Johnny Torrio had long understood that time was the ultimate teacher. Johnny Torrio had spent decades navigating a world of calculated risks, alliances, and unseen threats, and now, in the quiet of his later years, he could observe life with a clarity that only distance and reflection could provide. The lessons of his past were no longer immediate. They were patterns, probabilities, and truths laid bare by the passage of years. He had always valued foresight over force, observation over reaction, and patience over impulsiveness, and these qualities continued to define him. In the stillness of his routine, Torrio considered the human tendency to mistake visibility for power. Many men equated dominance with recognition, assuming that those who acted loudly commanded influence. Torrio had long known that this was an illusion. True influence was subtle, exercised without drawing attention, shaping outcomes quietly while remaining largely unseen. He had applied this principle consistently, and it had been central to both his effectiveness and his survival. The quieter, more deliberate actions often carried the greatest consequences. He reflected on the dynamics of trust and loyalty. Throughout his life, Torrio had learned that both were conditional, fragile, and often misunderstood. People claimed allegiance, yet their actions were frequently guided by opportunity rather than principle. He had mastered the art of discerning true intentions, observing behaviors that others overlooked, and acting only when the balance of risk and reward aligned favorably. That careful evaluation had prevented countless disasters and allowed him to navigate dangerous environments with precision. Torrio thought about the nature of ambition. Ambition was a driving force, but unchecked, it could become a liability. Many men he had known sought rapid advancement, acting impulsively to assert dominance or gain recognition. Such impatience often led to mistakes, miscalculations, and ultimately, failure. Torrio had consistently resisted that impulse, valuing patience and observation over immediate gratification. He understood that timing was critical, and that restraint could achieve outcomes far more enduring than rash action. In his reflections, he also considered the subtle mechanics of power. People often misunderstood its essence, equating it with visibility, coercion, or aggression. Torrio recognized that true power operated invisibly. It lay in the ability to influence outcomes without exposure, to anticipate events before they unfolded, and to act or refrain from acting with precision. He had applied these principles not for spectacle, but for survival and effectiveness. The quiet, strategic use of power had defined his life. He examined the consequences of human error, noting that most failures were predictable in retrospect. Men often acted on incomplete information, underestimated the complexity of situations, or allowed pride to override judgment. Torrio had avoided these pitfalls through deliberate observation and careful analysis. By recognizing the predictable patterns of behavior, he had consistently maintained an advantage over those who acted impulsively. Even removed from the intensity of his earlier environment, Torrio continued to apply these lessons. He observed societal changes, shifts in business and politics, and the predictable repetition of human behavior across different contexts. Greed, fear, ambition, and pride remained constants, shaping outcomes in ways that were remarkably consistent despite evolving circumstances. His insights, honed over decades, allowed him to interpret events with clarity that few others possessed. Torrio also reflected on the distinction between immediate reward and long-term benefit. Many men were driven by visible outcomes, seeking recognition or short-term gain without considering the broader implications. Torrio had always prioritized sustainability, structuring decisions and relationships to endure beyond the immediate moment. He understood that patience often yielded outcomes far greater than impulsive action, and that the appearance of inactivity could mask careful strategic calculation. He contemplated the importance of discretion. The ability to remain unnoticed while influencing events was a powerful advantage. Torrio had long understood that exposure invited risk, while invisibility preserved autonomy and provided leverage. He had exercised restraint not out of fear, but as a deliberate strategy to maintain control over circumstances without drawing attention. Observation and patience, combined with strategic silence, had allowed him to navigate treacherous environments successfully. In these later years, Torrio recognized the value of perspective. Time removed the urgency of decision-making, allowing him to view events with calm analysis. He could see the consequences of action and inaction unfold with remarkable clarity. noting how human tendencies repeated predictably across generations. Impulsiveness, impatience, and overconfidence led to failure, while foresight, patience, and restraint facilitated endurance. These observations confirmed the principles that had guided his life. He also considered the role of contingency. Circumstances could shift suddenly, and no plan was ever perfect. Torrio had learned to anticipate multiple scenarios, preparing for uncertainty rather than assuming control. This flexibility, combined with disciplined observation, allowed him to adapt without panic and act when conditions were favorable. Survival and effectiveness depended not on rigid control but on the capacity to navigate uncertainty with composure. Torrio reflected on the lessons of restraint, noting that the avoidance of unnecessary conflict often produced more favorable outcomes than confrontation. He had mastered the balance between engagement and withdrawal, recognizing that strategic patience frequently carried greater weight than action motivated by impulse. Decisions made quietly, observed carefully, and executed deliberately had shaped his life more than any dramatic gesture could have. He also recognized the value of independence. Autonomy required detachment from expectation, the ability to act according to judgment rather than compulsion. Torrio had cultivated this detachment throughout his life, and in his later years, it allowed him to observe without interference, analyze without distraction, and maintain clarity in the midst of complexity. Independence, he understood, was both a tool and a reward. In the stillness of his days, Johnny Torrio appreciated the subtle, enduring influence of observation. He had lived a life defined by patience, foresight, and careful analysis. He had understood human behavior, anticipated consequences, and acted with discretion. Even removed from danger, his insights remained relevant. As patterns of human conduct continued to unfold predictably, Torrio found satisfaction in understanding the mechanics of behavior and the enduring principles that shaped outcomes. He considered the culmination of his experiences as a form of mastery and understanding that survival, influence, and effectiveness were determined less by visible action and more by quiet observation, measured response, and strategic patience. His life had been shaped by these principles, and in later years he could see their application clearly in the world around him. The consistency of human behavior, the predictable consequences of action and inaction, and the enduring value of foresight confirmed the wisdom of his approach. Johnny Torrio had lived a life defined by strategy, discipline, and awareness. He had navigated danger, ambition, and complexity with foresight and restraint. He had observed patterns, anticipated outcomes, and acted with precision. In his later years, removed from immediate concern, he experienced the rare satisfaction of witnessing the world unfold according to principles he had long understood, confirming the enduring relevance of patience, observation, and subtle influence. Johnny Torrio had always understood that survival, influence, and clarity were inseparable, and in the quiet of his later years, this understanding had crystallized into a profound awareness of life's patterns. Johnny Torrio observed the world with the patience cultivated over decades, noticing how the same human impulses, ambition, fear, pride, and greed manifested predictably, regardless of era or circumstance. He recognized that while circumstances evolved, the mechanics of behavior remained remarkably consistent, and the mastery of these mechanics had defined both his life and legacy. He reflected on the subtle interplay between action and consequence. Many men rushed into decisions, convinced that movement equated to control. They pursued recognition, dominance, and immediate results, failing to anticipate the ripple effects of their choices. Torrio had learned early that true influence required restraint, observation, and precise timing. Action taken without these elements often led to error and vulnerability, while well-timed inaction preserved autonomy and allowed outcomes to unfold in one's favor. In solitude, Torrio appreciated the elegance of strategic patience. Waiting was not idle, it was deliberate. It allowed observation, comprehension, and the assessment of probability. By letting events develop, he could understand motivations, anticipate reactions, and position himself advantageously without the need for dramatic gestures or overt displays of power. The quiet accumulation of understanding, he realized, often outweighed any single act of aggression or decision made in haste. He considered the importance of discretion in all aspects of life. Visibility, while alluring to many, often invited vulnerability. Torrio had long understood that influence exercised quietly was far more durable than power flaunted publicly. Decisions executed with subtlety carried less risk and produced more enduring results. He had structured his life around this principle, ensuring that he could navigate complex environments while remaining largely unobserved. Observation, reflection, and controlled engagement became the pillars of his enduring strategy. Torrio reflected on the concept of loyalty. Human allegiance, he had observed, was rarely absolute. It was often conditional, shifting with circumstances and opportunity. Recognizing this truth allowed him to assess relationships accurately and avoid reliance on fragile bonds. By understanding the limits of loyalty, he mitigated risk and positioned himself to respond effectively when expectations failed. Patience, observation, and discernment had long been more valuable than trust and verbal promises. He thought about the role of foresight, anticipating consequences, both immediate and long-term, had been central to his survival. Every choice carried potential outcomes, and every outcome carried implications beyond the immediate moment. Torrio had learned to evaluate the probable impact of decisions, weighing risk and reward with meticulous care. This approach had guided him through environments that demanded rapid adaptation, had preserved his autonomy when others succumbed to impulse and miscalculation. In reflecting on human error, Torrio noted how predictably men repeated mistakes. Impulsiveness, overconfidence, and disregard for probability often undermined ambition. Individuals overestimated their control and underestimated complexity, producing predictable consequences. Torrio had cultivated a life structured to minimize exposure to these errors. Observation, discretion, and calculated decision-making allowed him to navigate environments fraught with danger and unpredictability. Even in retirement, he appreciated the universality of these lessons. He contemplated the balance between visibility and anonymity. Many sought recognition obsessively, equating fame with power. Torrio, however, recognized that true influence required subtlety and often thrived in obscurity. By remaining largely unseen, he could guide outcomes, observe behavior, and preserve autonomy. The ability to act without attracting undue attention, to shape circumstance without confrontation, had been a defining principle of his life. The quieter influence, he knew, often had the greatest durability. He also reflected on the value of autonomy. Independence, he realized, required detachment from external pressures and expectations. The freedom to act or refrain from acting according to judgment rather than compulsion was a rare advantage. Torrio had cultivated this autonomy deliberately, and it allowed him to assess events clearly, choose courses of action wisely, and avoid entanglement in conflicts that could compromise his position. Autonomy was both a strategic asset and a reward of disciplined living. In considering human behavior, Torrio observed the interplay of ambition and restraint. Impulse often undermined success, while patience facilitated it. Those who acted without forethought frequently encountered predictable obstacles, while those who waited, observed, and calculated maintained the upper hand. Torrio had spent decades refining this understanding, learning to recognize the optimal moments for engagement and the moments when inaction was the most strategic response. He also contemplated the importance of learning from experience. Every interaction, observation, and decision provided data that could be analyzed to improve future outcomes. Torrio had internalized this approach, treating every event as an opportunity to refine judgment. This cumulative understanding allowed him to navigate uncertainty with composure, adapt to shifting circumstances, and maintain influence even in complex, unpredictable environments. The mastery of observation and reflection had become a defining characteristic of his life. Torrio considered the enduring significance of structure and preparation. Systems, he had observed, were far more resilient than reliance on individual brilliance or impulsive action. By constructing reliable frameworks for decision-making, anticipating contingencies, and preparing for multiple scenarios, he minimized vulnerability and maximized control. The foresight to build systems that endured beyond immediate attention had been central to both survival and influence throughout his life. He reflected on the principle of proportionality in action. Force, aggression, or confrontation were tools, not defaults. Their effectiveness depended on timing, context, and necessity. Torrio had consistently assessed the cost and benefit of engagement, choosing discretion when it preserved advantage and acting decisively only when conditions favored success. The ability to modulate action according to circumstance had been a hallmark of his strategic approach and had ensured longevity where others faltered. In his quiet moments, Johnny Torrio appreciated the rare clarity that came from distance, reflection, and observation. Life, he understood, was a series of patterns, choices, and consequences. The mastery of patience, foresight, discretion, and calculated engagement allowed him to navigate complexity effectively. He had lived a life defined not by spectacle, but by strategy, not by immediate reward, but by enduring influence, and not by impulsive action, but by deliberate, measured response. The satisfaction of his later years was not derived from recognition or fame, but from understanding, the profound comprehension of patterns, behaviors, and consequences that few ever achieved. Torrio could witness events unfold, observe human nature in motion, and appreciate the enduring lessons of his life. Observation, reflection, strategic patience, and discretion remained the principles that had guided him and ensured his survival. In this clarity, he found a rare and lasting peace, the quiet culmination of a life lived with foresight, discipline, and deliberate mastery. Johnny Torrio had learned that life was not measured merely by action, but by understanding the consequences of every choice. Johnny Torrio had spent decades navigating a world where miscalculation meant vulnerability, and patience often ensured survival. Now, in the calm of later years, he reflected on the intricate patterns of human behavior and the subtle mechanisms by which influence and control were maintained. He understood that the most enduring power lay not in visibility, confrontation, or spectacle, but in foresight, observation, and the deliberate exercise of restraint. He observed how impulsiveness, ambition, and pride frequently led men to overreach. They acted quickly, seeking recognition, believing that momentum equated to mastery. Torrio had long recognized the illusion in this assumption. True mastery, he knew, required patience and a careful assessment of probability. The most powerful decisions were often invisible, the most influential actions executed without fanfare. In his earlier life, he had thrived by understanding these principles. Now removed from immediate pressure, he appreciated their enduring relevance more profoundly. Torrio reflected on the subtle art of perception management. Human behavior was largely driven by expectation and perception, not solely by fact or rationality. Many men misjudged situations because they assumed others saw the world as they did. Torrio had long exploited these perceptual gaps, allowing assumptions to shape outcomes to his advantage. This approach required quiet observation, strategic restraint, and precise timing, but it yielded results that visibility and aggression rarely achieved. Influence, he realized, was most potent when it operated beneath the surface. He considered the importance of discretion in all endeavors. Many men believed that recognition signaled strength, but Torrio understood that exposure often invited vulnerability. True influence was subtle, executed quietly, and maintained without drawing attention. Decisions taken with measured deliberation and strategic silence carried far more weight than impulsive, visible action. In the quieter aspects of life, Torrio had found freedom, autonomy, and the ability to shape outcomes without unnecessary risk. He also reflected on the delicate mechanics of loyalty and trust. Human allegiance, he had observed, was rarely absolute. People often acted according to opportunity, convenience, or fear rather than principle. Torrio had learned to read these patterns, to distinguish between reliable allies and those whose commitment was conditional. Observation and discernment allowed him to navigate relationships effectively, ensuring that reliance on others did not create unnecessary risk. Loyalty, he understood, was best evaluated through behavior rather than words. In contemplating human error, Torrio recognized the inevitability of mistakes, both minor and consequential. The majority arose not from malice but from impatience, overconfidence, or a misunderstanding of probability. Torrio had consistently mitigated these risks through careful observation, patience, and strategic decision-making. By anticipating likely outcomes and preparing for contingencies, he preserved autonomy and minimized exposure to threat. Even in retirement, he saw these lessons manifest in the lives of others, confirming their universality. He thought about the principle of timing, which had guided his life repeatedly. Action executed too early often invited resistance. Action executed too late risked irrelevance. Timing, combined with observation and discretion, allowed him to influence outcomes effectively. The decision to act or not to act was rarely intuitive. It was calculated, deliberate, and informed by an understanding of probability, human nature, and circumstance. Torrio had consistently applied this principle to navigate environments of complexity and danger. Torrio reflected on ambition and its interplay with restraint. Ambition was a driving force, yet unchecked it could lead to vulnerability and error. Those who pursued rapid advancement frequently misjudged risks, overestimated control, or underestimated complexity. Torrio had long tempered his ambition with foresight and patience, understanding that deliberate, measured progress often produced more enduring influence than impulsive action. Ambition without discipline, he recognized, was a frequent precursor to downfall. In solitude, he also appreciated the enduring value of structure and preparation. Systems, whether in relationships, business, or strategy, offered stability that individuals alone could not provide. Torrio had cultivated structures that allowed influence to persist even in his absence. By anticipating multiple scenarios and preparing for contingencies, he had minimized vulnerability and maximized adaptability. These principles applied universally, extending beyond the criminal world to the broader patterns of human activity he now observed. He contemplated the role of perception and influence in shaping outcomes. Humans often acted based on the expectations and assumptions of others. By guiding these perceptions quietly and subtly, Torrio had often achieved outcomes with minimal confrontation. Influence exercised invisibly allowed for autonomy, discretion, and strategic advantage. Many sought recognition as proof of power. Yet Torrio understood that influence often functioned most effectively when concealed, operating beneath the notice of those it affected. Even removed from immediate conflict, he considered the lessons of risk. Every decision carried potential consequences, and risk itself was neither inherently dangerous nor inherently rewarding. Its impact depended on recognition, evaluation, and preparation. Torrio had learned to assess probability, weigh potential outcomes, and act decisively only when conditions favored success. Survival, he realized, was as much about avoiding unnecessary exposure as it was about executing calculated action. In his reflections, Torrio also observed the predictable cycles of human behavior. Fear, greed, pride, and ambition consistently drove action, often producing similar outcomes across different eras and contexts. Impulsiveness undermined success, while patience and careful observation facilitated it. Even removed from his former world, he could observe these patterns manifest in business, politics, and social interactions. These observations confirmed the universality of the principles that had guided his life. Johnny Torrio considered autonomy as a rare and invaluable asset. Independence required detachment from expectation, the capacity to act without compulsion, and the ability to observe without interference. He had cultivated this independence deliberately, and it allowed him to assess circumstances clearly, make informed decisions, and avoid entanglement in conflicts that could compromise his position. Autonomy was both strategic and personal, a source of freedom and resilience. He reflected on the culmination of his life's lessons: patience, observation, restraint, foresight, discretion, and structured preparation. These principles had defined his success and longevity. Survival was rarely the result of force or aggression alone. It was achieved through understanding, analysis, and careful decision-making. Influence, in its most enduring form, operated quietly, subtly, and strategically. The mastery of these principles had ensured that Johnny Torrio navigated danger successfully, shaped outcomes effectively, and maintained autonomy throughout a complex and unpredictable life. In these quiet moments, Torrio experienced a satisfaction few could comprehend. He had witnessed the world unfold, observed human nature in motion, and applied principles that transcended circumstance and era. Observation, reflection, and strategic patience remained his tools. Even in the absence of immediate threats, these tools continued to provide clarity, understanding, and the quiet authority that defined a life lived with foresight, discipline, and deliberate mastery. The culmination of experience, insight, and patience had created a life marked by subtle power, enduring influence, and profound comprehension. Johnny Torrio had long realized that life was less about the battles one fought and more about understanding the currents that carried people forward or pulled them under. Johnny Torrio had spent decades navigating a world of ambition, risk, and subtle influence, and in the quiet of his later years he could trace the patterns of human behavior with an almost clinical clarity. He understood that impulsiveness, overconfidence, and misjudged loyalty often spelled the downfall of those who moved without foresight, while careful observation, patience, and calculated action enabled survival and enduring influence. He reflected on the subtleties of timing, recognizing it as one of the most powerful yet underappreciated tools available to any strategist. Men often believed that speed equated to effectiveness, that movement alone demonstrated strength. Torrio had learned early that the opposite was frequently true. The ability to wait, to observe without interference, and to strike or intervene only when circumstance aligned, provided a power that visibility and brute force could never replicate. Timing, patience, and understanding the motivations of others had guided him safely through environments that destroyed many of his peers. In his contemplations, Torrio considered the intricate web of human perception. Individuals rarely acted solely on facts. More often, they were guided by assumptions, expectations, and interpretations of what others believed. This insight had allowed him to influence outcomes without confrontation, to guide decisions invisibly, and to preserve autonomy in situations where overt power might have provoked resistance. Understanding perception had become as critical to his survival as understanding probability, risk, or loyalty. He observed how ambition, when untethered by prudence, frequently became a liability. Men driven by immediate gain or recognition often misjudged their environment, underestimated competitors, or overlooked subtle threats. Torrio had learned to temper ambition with restraint, prioritizing long-term stability over momentary advantage. The quiet cultivation of influence, he realized, often produced results far more enduring than dramatic displays of power or fleeting victories achieved by rash action. Torrio reflected on trust and the fragile nature of human allegiance. Loyalty was often conditional, dependent on circumstance and convenience. Recognizing the limitations of trust allowed him to structure relationships strategically, mitigating risk while maximizing potential for cooperation. He had learned to read behavior carefully, distinguishing genuine commitment from opportunistic compliance. Observation, discernment, and the ability to anticipate shifting loyalty had become essential elements of his strategic approach. He considered the management of risk as a central principle guiding his life. Every decision carried potential consequences, and each outcome was shaped by variables often invisible to the untrained eye. Torrio had spent decades assessing probability, weighing potential outcomes, and acting decisively when conditions favored success. Risk was not inherently dangerous. Danger arose only when it was unrecognized or underestimated. Understanding and managing this reality had preserved his life and enabled the careful expansion of his influence. Even in retirement, Torrio maintained a disciplined awareness of his environment. He observed societal shifts, changes in economic and political structures, and the predictable repetition of human behavior. Greed, ambition, pride, and fear continued to drive actions across generations, just as they had in his youth. Patterns repeated themselves, and those who failed to observe them suffered the consequences. Torrio's foresight and structured approach allowed him to maintain clarity without direct engagement. He reflected on the principle of restraint, which had defined much of his life. Without context, without preparation, or without consideration of consequence frequently led to vulnerability. By contrast, strategic patience allowed outcomes to develop in his favor. The ability to wait, to assess, and to intervene with precision was more valuable than any display of force or command. Torrio understood that influence exercised subtly was often the most effective, enduring, and least risky form of power. In solitude, he contemplated the universality of human behavior. Mistakes arose predictably from impatience, overconfidence, or misinterpretation of circumstances. Success followed patterns of careful observation, preparation, and judicious action. Even removed from the immediacy of his former world, Torrio could observe these dynamics in business, politics, and social interactions, confirming that the principles guiding his life were not confined to any single context. Observation, foresight, and strategic restraint were universally applicable. He considered the importance of autonomy. Independence allowed one to act without coercion, evaluate circumstance without interference, and maintain clarity in decision-making. Torrio had cultivated this autonomy deliberately, and it remained a cornerstone of his influence. Detachment from immediate pressures or expectations permitted him to navigate situations objectively, minimizing vulnerability while maximizing strategic advantage. Autonomy was both a practical tool and a profound personal reward. Torrio also reflected on the interplay of observation and action. Observation alone was insufficient. It required the ability to act with precision when circumstances demanded it. Conversely, action without observation often led to error. The combination of measured observation, disciplined reflection, and timely action had guided him through environments filled with unpredictability and risk. These skills, honed over decades, continued to provide clarity and strategic insight even in his later years. He contemplated the subtleties of influence, recognizing that the most enduring outcomes were often shaped quietly, invisibly, and without confrontation. Men frequently sought recognition as proof of power, yet influence that remained unseen often persisted longer and exerted greater effect. Torrio had spent his life mastering this principle, cultivating relationships, shaping perceptions, structuring decisions in ways that produced enduring impact without attracting unnecessary attention. Subtlety, he realized, was as powerful as force. In reflection, he acknowledged the cumulative value of experience. Every decision, every observation, every interaction contributed to a body of knowledge that allowed him to navigate complexity with confidence. Life's patterns revealed themselves over time, and the mastery of these patterns provided clarity and security. Torrio had spent decades refining his understanding, translating observation into action, and translating insight into enduring influence. Even in the quiet of retirement, Torrio appreciated the consistency of human nature. Fear, ambition, pride, and greed continued to shape behavior in ways that were strikingly predictable. Impulsiveness led to error, patience facilitated survival, and foresight allowed one to navigate uncertainty. These truths, learned in the crucible of danger, remained relevant throughout his life and offered a lens through which to interpret the unfolding world. Johnny Torrio had lived a life defined by strategic awareness, disciplined restraint, and careful observation. He had survived environments that many could not navigate, influenced outcomes with overt displays of power, and maintained autonomy through foresight and patience. In the reflective calm of later years, he appreciated the culmination of his experience, the patterns of human behavior, and the principles that had guided him. Observation, patience, strategic action, and subtle influence had shaped a life of enduring clarity, quiet authority, and profound understanding. Johnny Torrio had long understood that the essence of influence lay not in visibility, confrontation, or immediate recognition, but in careful observation, measured action, and strategic restraint. Johnny Torrio had spent decades navigating a world filled with ambition, risk, and shifting alliance, and in the quiet of his later years, he could finally appreciate the clarity that time provided. He had observed countless men act impulsively, driven by desire, ego, or impatience, only to face consequences they could not anticipate. Torrio had learned to navigate such environments not through force, but through insight, discretion, and timing. In the stillness of his routine, Torrio reflected on the delicate balance between patience and action. Men often believed that swift movement signaled strength. Yet, the most enduring influence often arose from restraint. Observing circumstances unfold, understanding human motivations, and waiting for the precise moment to act had been principles that guided him for decades. Timing, he realized, was more than a matter of opportunity. It was the intersection of understanding, preparation, and human psychology. He considered the nature of ambition and its consequences. While ambition could drive achievement, unchecked ambition often led to mistakes, miscalculations, and vulnerability. Torrio had long tempered his own ambitions with prudence, weighing each decision against potential outcomes and anticipating the likely reactions of others. This careful deliberation allowed him to navigate environments where impulsiveness and overconfidence destroyed countless men who underestimated the subtle currents of power and influence. Torrio reflected on the role of trust and the fragile nature of human loyalty. Trust was often conditional, shifting according to circumstance, opportunity, and self-interest. Observing behaviors carefully allowed him to discern reliability, predict shifts in allegiance, and avoid unnecessary risk. He had cultivated relationships strategically, understanding that loyalty was not a static trait but a variable, dependent on human nature and situational factors. Observation and analysis had always provided a more reliable guide than words alone. He also contemplated the subtle mechanisms of influence. True power, Torrio understood, often operated invisibly, guiding outcomes without exposure. Many men equated visibility with authority, assuming that recognition signaled control. Yet, influence exercised quietly frequently carried the greatest durability. By shaping perceptions, anticipating reactions, and structuring decisions carefully, Torrio achieved results without provoking opposition or revealing vulnerability. Subtlety, patience, and foresight had become hallmarks of his approach. Even removed from immediate danger, he observed the recurring patterns of human behavior. Fear, pride, greed, and ambition consistently shaped decisions, producing predictable consequences. Individuals repeatedly miscalculated and influenced by impulse or emotion, while the patient observer maintained advantage. Torrio had long relied on this understanding to preserve autonomy, mitigate risk, and influence outcomes effectively. Even in retirement, these patterns continued to unfold around him, confirming the timelessness of the lessons he had learned. He thought about the principle of risk management, recognizing that every decision carried potential consequences. Risk itself was not inherently dangerous, but unrecognized or mismanaged risk created vulnerability. Torrio had spent decades assessing probability, weighing outcomes, and acting decisively when circumstances favored success. This disciplined approach had preserved his life, extended his influence, and enabled him to navigate volatile environments with composure and insight. Understanding risk, he realized, was as critical as any other strategic principle. Torrio reflected on the importance of autonomy. Independence allowed him to act without compulsion, evaluate circumstances objectively, and maintain clarity in judgment. Detachment from immediate pressures, expectations, and external demands enabled him to navigate environments strategically, avoiding entanglement in conflicts that could compromise his position. Autonomy was both a practical tool for survival and a source of personal satisfaction, granting freedom of thought, discretion, and calculated action. He also examined the interplay of observation and timing. Observation alone was insufficient. It required the capacity to act with precision when the moment demanded. Action without observation, conversely, frequently led to error. Torrio had honed the ability to balance these two forces, waiting for circumstances to reveal themselves fully before intervening strategically. This balance had guided him through treacherous situations and ensured his long-term survival and influence. In reflection, Torrio acknowledged the universality of human error. Impulsiveness, pride, impatience, and misjudged ambition were constants that repeatedly undermined individuals. Conversely, patience, foresight, and strategic action consistently produced favorable outcomes. He had internalized these lessons over decades, structuring decisions and behaviors to capitalize on predictable patterns and mitigate vulnerabilities. This awareness allowed him to navigate complexity with confidence and clarity. He considered the importance of strategic restraint. Many men equated inaction with weakness, yet the deliberate choice to wait, observe, and preserve autonomy often created the greatest advantage. Torrio had repeatedly employed restraint as a tool, allowing circumstances to unfold while maintaining the ability to intervene decisively when necessary. Influence, he understood, was strongest when exercised subtly, without drawing attention or provoking resistance. The quiet mastery of timing and action defined his approach. Torrio reflected on the role of experience. Every encounter, every observation, every miscalculation provided data to inform future decisions. The accumulation of knowledge allowed him to anticipate outcomes, understand motivations, and act with confidence. In this way, experience became a form of power, granting foresight and clarity that few could match. His ability to translate observation into strategic advantage had been central to his survival and enduring influence. He observed the cyclical nature of human behavior. Across generations, patterns repeated: ambition outpaced prudence, impatience undermined opportunity, and the desire for recognition often eclipsed strategic thinking. Torrio had navigated these cycles successfully by applying discipline, observation, understanding motivations, and exercising restraint. Even in the changing world around him, these principles continued to hold true. reaffirming the timelessness of strategic foresight and careful judgment. Johnny Torrio also contemplated the culmination of his life's lessons, the interdependence of observation, patience, discretion, and timing. Survival, influence, and understanding were not the products of impulsive action or visibility, but of measured, deliberate engagement with the world. His life had been defined by subtle mastery of these principles, allowing him to navigate danger, shape outcomes, and maintain autonomy. Even in retirement, these principles remained relevant, guiding his reflections and offering clarity in a complex, unpredictable world. In the quiet of his later years, Johnny Torrio found a sense of completion and satisfaction. He had lived a life guided by foresight, discipline, and strategic patience. He had observed human nature, anticipated consequences, and acted with precision when necessary. He had preserved autonomy, managed risk, and exercised influence without unnecessary exposure. The culmination of his experience and insight had created a life of enduring clarity, subtle authority, and profound understanding, a life that exemplified the quiet power of observation, foresight, and deliberate action. Johnny Torrio, in the closing years of his life, had developed a perspective on existence that was both sharp and serene. Johnny Torrio had traversed a world fraught with danger, ambition, shifting loyalties, and unseen threats, and he now observed it with the clarity that only decades of experience could provide. He recognized patterns where others saw chaos, understood consequences where others saw chance, and perceived influence where others assumed power depended on visibility. Life, for him, was an intricate web of action, reaction, and foresight, and he had mastered the subtle art of navigating it. He reflected on the delicate interplay of risk and restraint. The human instinct was often to act first and consider consequences later, yet Torrio had learned that measured patience could accomplish more than impulsive effort. In his world, decisions made with precision, informed by observation, and execute at the opportune moment carried outcomes far more lasting than any hasty maneuver. Risk itself was not inherently perilous. It became perilous only when it was misjudged or confronted without understanding. By observing, waiting, and calculating, he had consistently maintained the upper hand. Torrio's mind often dwelled on the psychology of ambition. He had witnessed countless men driven by desire for recognition or immediate gain only to stumble, because they had neglected to weigh consequences or consider the intentions of others. Ambition, untempered by foresight, frequently created vulnerability. Torrio had cultivated a form of ambition guided by awareness, observation, and strategic patience, allowing him to pursue objectives with efficiency while avoiding exposure to unnecessary danger. Patience had proven to be as potent a weapon as any overt action. In these reflections, he also considered the mechanics of influence. Most individuals misunderstood power, equating it with visibility or coercion. But Torrio had always known that subtle guidance, anticipation of human behavior, and quiet control produced results far more enduring. Influence exercised invisibly allowed him to shape outcomes without confrontation, preserve autonomy, and maintain strategic advantage. Recognition, he understood, was often a distraction from true efficacy. Lasting influence rarely needed notice. He pondered the fleeting nature of trust and loyalty. Human allegiance was rarely constant, often dependent on convenience, circumstance, or self-interest. Torrio had learned to read behavior carefully, distinguishing reliable partners from opportunists. Observation, analysis, and the ability to anticipate changes in loyalty had enabled him to construct networks that functioned reliably without being dependent on idealized notions of fidelity. Understanding the conditions under which loyalty could shift was as vital as recognizing when it was genuine. Torrio reflected on the rhythm of human error. Patterns repeated across generations. Impulsiveness undermined success. Overconfidence led to misjudgment, and pride distorted perception. He had long relied on these patterns to guide action, maintain discretion, and anticipate outcomes. Even as society evolved around him, the underlying mechanics of behavior remained consistent. Observation, strategic restraint, and informed judgment had been more reliable than any forceful measure or attempt at dominance. He also considered the role of autonomy in achieving clarity. Independence allowed one to act according to judgment, unencumbered by external expectation or coercion. Torrio had cultivated this independence carefully, understanding that freedom to observe and Evaluate without interference was essential for informed decision-making. Autonomy provided both strategic advantage and personal peace, enabling him to navigate complex environments without becoming entangled in unnecessary conflict or exposure. The interplay of observation, timing, and action was central to Torrio's philosophy. Observing circumstances alone was insufficient. Decisive intervention at the precise moment was critical. Conversely, action without observation was often self-defeating. Torrio had perfected the balance, learning when to wait, when to analyze, and when to act with precision. This ability to harmonize observation and timing had guided him safely through decades of volatility and danger, ensuring survival and maximizing influence with minimal risk. He contemplated the cyclical nature of human behavior and the predictability of consequence. Across different contexts, the same impulses drove action: ambition, pride, fear, greed, and desire. Those who acted impulsively often faced predictable setbacks, while those who employed patience and foresight maintained advantage. Torrio observed these cycles with calm detachment, recognizing that understanding patterns was more valuable than reacting to isolated events. Mastery of these cycles provided clarity, strategic insight, and enduring stability. Torrio also reflected on the subtle art of perception management. People rarely acted on facts alone. Their behavior was shaped by assumptions about what others thought, believed, or expected. By guiding perception invisibly, he could influence outcomes without confrontation. The quiet exercise of influence, imperceptible yet profound, allowed him to maintain control while avoiding exposure. Torrio had long understood that real power often functioned beneath the surface, unnoticed yet decisive in its effects. In his contemplation of legacy, Torrio realized that true accomplishment was not measured by fame, notoriety, or overt dominance. Enduring influence, structural foresight, and the ability to navigate human behavior were far more meaningful. He had built a life that shaped outcomes quietly, maintained autonomy strategically, and utilized insight as a tool of power. The subtlety of this achievement, largely invisible to the world, was precisely what ensured its durability and effectiveness. He also considered the importance of learning from experience. Every observation, interaction, and decision provided data that informed future judgment. Mistakes taught caution, success reinforced understanding, and repeated patterns allowed prediction. Torrio had internalized these lessons over decades, refining his strategic approach and ensuring that knowledge gained from observation and reflection guided every subsequent action. Experience, he knew, was the foundation of both clarity and influence. Even in the quiet of retirement, Torrio maintained an acute awareness of the world's unfolding patterns. Social dynamics, human motivation, and the consequences of action remained consistent across time. The principles that had guided his life: patience, observation, strategic restraint, autonomy, and careful timing continued to demonstrate their enduring relevance. Life unfolded predictably when viewed through the lens of disciplined perception and foresight. Johnny Torrio's reflections ultimately returned to the interplay of foresight and restraint. Survival and influence were achieved not by impulsive action, visibility, or overt control, but by understanding circumstances, anticipating behavior, and acting precisely when conditions were favorable. His life had been defined by these principles, and they had preserved him in a world where impulsiveness, ambition, and misjudgment destroyed countless others. The mastery of patience, discretion, observation, and timing had allowed him to navigate danger, shape outcomes, and maintain autonomy with enduring effectiveness. In the stillness of his final contemplations, Torrio experienced the rare satisfaction of comprehension. He had witnessed the world unfold, observed human nature, applied timeless principles, and preserved autonomy through decades of uncertainty. Observation, foresight, discretion, and patience had guided him through complex environments, allowing influence without exposure and mastery without spectacle. The culmination of experience, strategic insight, and disciplined reflection had created a life of quiet authority, enduring clarity, and profound understanding, a life that epitomized the subtle power of calculated observation, strategic restraint, and deliberate action.